And this morning our program guest is the Shadow Treasurer and a prominent New South Wales Liberal, Joe Hockey. But before then, we'll see what the Sunday papers are making of it all. And Annabelle, show us the front pages.
Well, you know, in some ways this is the easiest state election in some time to report. I mean, you could have copy-set the front pages about a year ago, but there was an ancillary problem that arose, which was how to summon enough synonyms for the word catastrophe. In the early edition, the Sunday Telegraph just went with bye-bye, which kind of sums it up. And the Sun Herald's gone with bloodbath, which also fits on a front page. You know, it's a front page that people have been planning for a while. How do you sum up the dimension of this complete massacre?
And what was interesting about it, Gerard, was a lot of speculation about Labor ending up around about 20 seats. That's been going on for months, and that's where it landed.
That's where it's landed, but I would like to correct some of the analysis. Most of the analysis focuses on how badly Labor did. I think the analysis should be on how well Barry O'Farrell did. Barry O'Farrell worked very hard for 4 years, exerted enormous personal discipline, but he united the Liberal Party, which was no mean achievement, and he got the Liberals and the Nationals working together well, which is also no mean achievement. So I think the focus really should be on how well the Liberals did, because without the Liberals doing well, Labor wouldn't have done so badly.
Well, that was an issue that was taken up by two of the spokespersons for the campaigns last night, so we'll have a listen to that.
The heartland's gone. We'll save some sticks of furniture, but the seats we hold, we probably won't have a seat with a margin over 10%. Losing after 16 years is cyclical. Getting massacred after 16 years is not cyclical. Yeah. The driver of this result principally is a steely determination by a clear majority of voters to boot out this government.
If you took Luke's word as to what he was saying, you'd see a huge vote in the Independents and Greens. You'd see that protest vote being reflected in the Greens and Independents. That's not happening. Our primary vote is extremely high across the state. In seats which are Labor heartland, our primary vote has in some places doubled. That is an endorsement of the Liberal Nationals.
So, Brian, all things being equal, probably to take Gerard's point, Barry O'Farrell would have won anyway, but the massacre has to be mostly Labor's work.
No, I agree with Gerard on that. Look, people were extremely keen to boot Labor out, but yes, they could have gone to Independents and Greens and they didn't. And the reason they went to Barry O'Farrell, I think, is he comes across as moderate, he comes across as competent. Voters want to be assured that if they voted for the Liberals, they'd get someone who looked like he could be a reasonable and decent sort of Premier, which is how Barry O'Farrell comes across. And as Gerard said, he had a big job in that Liberal Party, which is torn by factionalism, to keep it together. As far as I know, he hasn't sort of compromised any of his own views or whatever in doing so. It'll be an immense job with such a huge backbench, and in one of the keys to state governments, I've got no money for him to deliver on what he wants to do. But I'm sure that a big factor in the result was that the swing, there was a very big swing to the Liberal National Party, and that was primarily because of Barry O'Farrell's leadership.
And I think what Mr O'Farrell promised above all is pretty important. He promised good government, and that's really what people want. That's what he's essentially promised, and that's what I believe he can deliver. It's going to be a difficult job, but he's very able and he works very hard, and he has a great grasp of detail, which at a state level is pretty well most of what you need. Gladys Berejiklian, I saw her on there before. I mean, she was also a very, very strong performer during the campaign.
You talk, though, about having to deliver, and, of course, public transport is going to be critical to that. But, Brian, there's going to be a question here about whether he gets his way or the federal government gets... But they want a different... they want the $2 billion or so spent on a completely different project.
He has said that he wants to be known as the person who fixed up transport in New South Wales. The trouble is, none of the state governments, possibly with the exception of Western Australia, have got any money. And it's very, very expensive. Fixing transport, fixing hospitals, which is another big area they've got primary responsibility for, state schools and so forth. And in this particular case, he wants to scrap a Labor proposal for which the federal government was prepared to give $2.1 billion and build a different railway line, one that goes to the northwest. And whether Labor says, no, you can't have that money, well, that'll leave him in a pickle. But I would have thought it would be very foolish for Julia Gillard to look like she's punishing someone who's just got elected with such a huge majority, and he went very clear about this. This is what he wanted to do.
Maybe they'll get Infrastructure Australia to have a look at it. It'll be a first time for everything.
Well, no, the Infrastructure Australia has looked at some New South Wales things, and then every time it decided that the submission was so bad that they couldn't possibly give them any money. And that was another point about just how incompetent the Labor government. The Labor was regarded as incompetent, scandal-ridden, and always doing things for its mates, putting mates into positions, etc.
I think beyond...
Barry O'Farrell's planning to abolish that Section 3A of the Planning Act, isn't he, which which centralises control.
No, it allows a minister to overrule planning decisions, which I think is very good. They have to be a bit careful that their independent commission can still overrule some councils, because there's some rotten council decisions.
Just further on the Greens too, and you say that it was a measure of the campaign that Barry O'Farrell ran, that they went straight to the Liberals and they didn't mess around. But is that too partly because the Greens in New South Wales are a different breed, that they're more radical than they are elsewhere?
Yeah, look, I reckon that one of the strong underlying messages from this campaign and its result is that the electorate has turned away from extremes, whether it's extremes of political belief or private behaviour or whatever, you know. This is kind of a middle-of-the-road result. And the Greens will be very upset. I think they didn't manage to pull off a victory in Balmain or the seat of Marrickville, which is held by Carmel Tebbit. There was some pretty interesting last-minute manoeuvring going on in that seat. Carmel Tebbit put out a very non-Labor sort of flyer which went up on every door handle in the seat of Marrickville on Friday night. It says, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," and says that Carmel Tebbit's a person with integrity, so we should keep her. I reckon that would have played quite a significant part in keeping her going in Marrickville.
That is true, and I think Carmel Tebbit's a very good candidate, but we can't overlook Fiona Byrne, the Greens candidate in Marrickville, advocacy of a ban on exports and imports from Israel. See, I agree with what Barry's saying. The Greens in New South Wales are very radical. Lee Rhiannon, who's about to take a Senate spot, graduated from the Communist Party not all that long ago, straight into the Greens. You've got Fiona Byrne advocating a ban on Israel. And what I found was very interesting is how voters in inner city reacted to Fiona Byrne's suggestion. If she goes down, it'll probably be for that reason.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jared. I think that was a hugely controversial element in Marrickville, had support in some quarters, but I think partly because people just think, well, what the hell is a local council doing, getting itself tangled in Middle Eastern politics? And I think that the prospect of someone like Fiona Byrne moving that approach into state parliament.
There's another reason, I think a number of Liberal voters in that seat decided, as optional preferences in New South Wales, decided to give their preferences to Labor, which is what I would have done if I were a Liberal voter in that seat, over the Greens, and I think you'll find the preference flow has also helped, because finally the Liberals have had the good sense to realise that the Greens are much more their enemy than Labor is.
And if you look at federal implications, so we'll talk about the carbon tax in a second, but surely the message is about independence, and the message is to Rob Oakeshott, because within his region, independents took a hammering. Does this suggest, Brian, that they don't like the affiliation with Labor?
I think it does in that seat. I mean, I thought that he might have been able to do a Peter Andren and win as an independent and win a seat that was quite conservative by taking quite an anti-conservative stance. I don't think it's working out like that at all.
So this will put a lot of pressure on Rob Oakeshott?
Yes, it will, but I think there's another federal issue, and that is that they've lost their heartland in low-income seats, and I think federally and at the state level, Labor has to start focusing on those things. And they spend most of their time mixing with the big end of town businessmen, ending up getting jobs there and so forth and so on when they leave politics. They've got to look like they've got some concern, a genuine concern, not just stating it as a concern, for people in those low-income seats and doing something about it. And that's...
Yeah, but there's another point. The people in the low-income seats are less interested in the carbon tax and emissions trading scheme.
Yeah, sure.
The obsession with the carbon tax and emissions trading scheme is very much the obsession of people in secure employment, public servants, academics and others. People who are in self-employed, have to employ themselves, run small businesses. Those on low incomes have trouble paying the electricity bill, are not so interested in these great esoteric schemes for a country that produces 1% of global emissions internationally. So I think that's another problem for Labor.
But did it play into the state election?
Well, I believe it did. I think if you look at the votes in Newcastle and in the Illawarra and on the Central Coast to some extent? Yes, I do, because that's the area that's primarily concerned. That's the area we're talking about. There are a lot of people who are self-employed, a lot of low-income people, people who don't have permanent jobs. There's not big public services in many of those areas. I think that's Labor's problem. It's there. So it's not the problem of Labor associating with the big end of town and being involved in this matesocracy problem. That is part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is Labor is flirting with concepts that people on lower incomes and unsecure employment and less education worry will affect their lifestyle. And I
take your point, and when you do point out the Illawarra and Newcastle in that way, that is interesting. But nevertheless, the overall result was always going to be around about where it is.
And that's what the polls were showing. And also, the things that upset people in New South Wales were quite a few of the Labor government decisions to go to the big end of town, Macquarie Bank and that, to start running tollways and other people to run tunnels and so forth, to sweeten the pie for them. They said, we'll block off a lot of other roads. Some of the laws actually said you can't improve, the governments can't improve public transport or roads in those areas that would compete in the city tunnel. It tried to funnel all of the traffic through that tunnel, which caused immense anger. And Bob Carr, of course, couldn't fund it out of the cheaper way to do it is with public borrowing, because he'd passed a law saying that there could be no public debt in New South Wales.
Can I just say, I don't think that the carbon tax had, a kind of a specific measurable impact on this campaign, but I just think it kind of extended the awareness of a problem that was already there. Electricity pricing, complete mismanagement of the attempted privatisation of the electricity assets in New South Wales, this sort of out-of-control feeling of, cost of living, just vaulting. And then on top of that, you have another Labor administration announcing a carbon tax. I think that's a continuum. I think it intensified that feeling. I don't think it started anything new.
Yeah, well, electricity prices have been going up sharply in New South Wales, but have nothing to do with the carbon tax. Yeah. It was because the state government was taking all of the profits from those things rather than from the generators.
But it's got something to do with alternative energy.
Yeah, well,
pricing.
The point here is that then they've had to reinvest in the wires, the poles and wires sort of stuff, and that's what's put up the price.
Okay, leadership, and John Robertson's name is already out there, even though he represents the trade union image in the Parliament and was at the heart of the electricity row.
Well, yeah, the idea is that this would be a new start in leadership. Actually, it's likely, I suspect, to be a continuation of the old battle. When Carr and Egan tried to privatise the power facilities, utilities, more than a decade ago, it was the sort of Robertson ilk that was opposing it, has completely tangled with it ever since. So the Labor Party has got to make a decision, I suppose, about whether it feels that it was a mistake even to start on the privatisation originally, or whether it feels that it just buggered up the delivery. That's a pretty gateway
It won't matter to them because they'll have no say in what happens for several years to come. But Robinson's...
No, but it's the core of their dysfunction as a party that they can't answer that question for themselves.
He was a leading, or probably the dominant figure in the right-wing faction which has run New South Wales politics for a long while, and I think for that reason it would be foolish, and they're really on the nose, it would be foolish for them to make him a leader.
I think the problem with John Robertson is that he, from the New South Wales Labor Council, he undermined Morris Yema, and from the time that Morris Yema was undermined, Labor, who was probably always going to lose, then went in a steep downward movement. And undermining Morris Yema, I think, was very unwise. And John Robinson is part of the problem. But
Well, did you see Carr last night? Bob Carr said that he thought that this was absolutely an election that could have been won, and that this was an incredible tale in what you can do wrong to lose an election over the course of 4 years. He was fairly careful to set that parameter. I don't know. I think it probably goes a little bit further back.
Okay, we have to move on, but that's the papers, and the Shadow Treasurer, Joe Hockey, is next, and here he is during the week with his thoughts on how the election might turn out.